It was March 22, 1958, and Eddie Fisher came to Elizabeth Taylor's house to offer his condolences. He was her dead husband's best friend. He was also Debbie Reynolds' husband, America's sweetheart, the woman every family admired. He was just supposed to say he was sorry. What happened inside that house over the next few weeks would destroy the most beloved marriage in America, turn Elizabeth Taylor into the most hated woman in the country overnight, and start a scandal so brutal that theater owners received letters demanding her films be pulled from screens. But here's the part nobody talks about. 50 years later, Debbie Reynolds said something that nobody expected. And it changes everything. If this is the kind of story that pulls you in, the real, complicated, human side of Hollywood history, then subscribe before we go any further. There is so much more where this came from. To understand what happened in the spring of 1958, you have to understand what Mike Todd meant to Elizabeth Taylor, because without that understanding, none of what followed makes any sense at all. Elizabeth had been married before, to Conrad Hilton Jr., who was cruel, and to Michael Wilding, who was gentle but could not match the ferocious velocity at which Elizabeth moved through the world. But Mike Todd was something else entirely. He was a showman, a force of nature, a man who produced Around the World in 80 Days and won the Academy Award for Best Picture and spent money as though joy was the only currency that mattered. He was the first man who seemed to move at Elizabeth's speed, who could fill the enormous space that her personality required without being swallowed by it, and when she married him in February of 1957, people who knew her said something in her face relaxed for the very first time. She had been in the spotlight since she was 9 years old. She had never been allowed to simply be a woman in love without the entire apparatus of American media forming an opinion about it. With Mike Todd, she stopped caring about the opinions. She was, by every account, transformed. Then came the morning of March 22, 1958. Mike Todd's private plane, a Lockheed Lodestar he had named the Liz, went down over New Mexico in a storm. There were no survivors. Elizabeth had been scheduled to travel with him, but a respiratory infection had kept her in Los Angeles at the last moment. A detail that would haunt her for years, the strange mathematics of survival, the question of why she had been left behind. She was 26 years old, with a 4-month-old daughter and 2 sons from her previous marriage. People who were present in the days after the crash described a woman in a kind of shock that went beyond ordinary grief. Not dramatic, not performative, but genuinely, frightfully still, as though the engine that had always driven her at full speed had simply stopped. Eddie Fisher arrived at her door during those early weeks, and his presence was, on its surface, entirely appropriate. He and Mike Todd had been extraordinarily close, the kind of friendship where loyalty is not questioned and presence is understood as the right thing. Eddie was a star in his own right, a singer whose face appeared on nearly every major magazine in the country, whose marriage to Debbie Reynolds had been presented to the American public as the template for what happiness looked like. That he would go to Elizabeth's house was expected. That Debbie encouraged him to go was considered generous and decent. No one, in those early days, was reading anything into it. What grief does to people is that it dissolves the ordinary boundaries that structure daily life. The rules that govern behavior in ordinary times feel arbitrary against the backdrop of genuine loss, and the proximity that grief demands can become, over time, a kind of intimacy that neither party fully anticipates. Eddie Fisher visited Elizabeth Taylor repeatedly through the spring and into the summer of 1958, and the visits shifted in nature so gradually that even those closest to both of them struggled, afterward, to identify exactly when the line was crossed. What is documented is this. By the late summer, the nature of Eddie's presence in Elizabeth's life had moved beyond what anyone could describe as simple condolence, and by September, the entertainment press had begun to print the first cautious suggestions that something was not quite right between Eddie Fisher and his wife. Debbie Reynolds learned what was happening the way most people in that era learned difficult truths, not from her husband directly, but from the accumulating evidence of absence, from the changed quality of conversation, from phone calls that ended when she entered the room. She was 26 years old, the same age as Elizabeth, and she had an infant and a toddler and a public image so wholesome it had become both her greatest asset and, in that moment, her cage. She could not be messy. She was Debbie Reynolds, and Debbie Reynolds smiled and made everyone feel the world was safe. The situation she found herself in, betrayed by her husband and by the woman she had considered a friend, did not fit anywhere in that image, and so the image had to break. The news became public in September of 1958. The reaction was immediate, overwhelming, and almost entirely directed at one person. Not at Eddie Fisher, who had made vows to Debbie Reynolds and broken them. The full force of American public fury landed on Elizabeth Taylor, and it landed with a completeness that is, even now, astonishing to examine. Fan mail turned to hate mail practically overnight. Theater owners received organized letter campaigns demanding her pictures be removed from their screens. A television interviewer asked Eddie Fisher, live on air, how he could have done this to America's sweetheart, as though the primary victim was not Debbie Reynolds personally, but the national fantasy of domestic happiness that she had come to represent. What Elizabeth Taylor did not do in the months that followed is the most significant part of the story. She did not arrange a press conference at which she wept and asked for forgiveness. She did not retreat from public life. She did not issue a carefully constructed statement to reframe the narrative in her favor. She married Eddie Fisher in May of 1959, in Las Vegas, wearing a green chiffon dress and facing the cameras with the particular stillness she had developed over 2 decades of being looked at, not defiance exactly, but a settled interior certainty that the opinions of people who did not know her were not going to determine how she conducted her life. It was a position that cost her enormously in the short term and that history has, over the long term, treated with considerably more complexity than her contemporaries were prepared to manage. What seems clear, from accounts of people who were close to her, is that her feelings about Eddie Fisher were genuine. That the grief over Mike Todd and the attachment to Eddie had become entangled in ways she had not fully chosen. What also seems clear is that she understood exactly what she was stepping into. She had been famous since childhood. She knew what it meant to be loved by an audience and what it meant, therefore, to be turned upon by one. She walked forward anyway, and the word that keeps appearing in accounts from people who knew her is not reckless but determined, as though she had made a private decision about which things in her life were going to be governed by external judgment and which were not. The marriage to Eddie Fisher lasted 4 years. What it produced, unexpectedly, was the next chapter of Elizabeth Taylor's story, because it was while she was married to Eddie that she traveled to Rome to film Cleopatra, and it was on that set that she met Richard Burton, and what happened between them would make the Eddie Fisher scandal look, by comparison, like a minor domestic disturbance. But that is a different story. What matters here, in the years immediately following 1959, is what was happening to Debbie Reynolds while Elizabeth Taylor's life continued forward. Debbie Reynolds did something remarkable in the years after her divorce. She did not collapse. She raised her children, Carrie and Todd, largely on her own, continued working with a discipline that her colleagues consistently praised, performed in Las Vegas showrooms and on Broadway and in television films, and built a second career and then a third one. She was funny about it, eventually. That is perhaps the most impressive thing. She developed, over time, the ability to tell the story of the worst thing that had happened to her with a dry humor that acknowledged the absurdity without minimizing the pain, and audiences loved her for it in a way that was different from before, less fantasy, more truth. She also, for decades, maintained a clear position on Elizabeth Taylor. She did not mount public feuds that the tabloid press would have happily covered. But in interviews, when asked directly, she was honest. It had hurt. It had hurt in the way that betrayal by a friend hurts, which is differently and more deeply than betrayal by a stranger. She had trusted Elizabeth. They had socialized. The loss of that trust had been, in some ways, as painful as the loss of the marriage itself. This was not theatrical bitterness. It was the measured accounting of a woman who had processed something difficult and arrived at a conclusion that was neither forgiveness nor performance. And then came the thing that nobody saw coming. By the 2000s, both women had lived long enough that the original scandal had acquired the quality of very old history, something journalists brought up in interviews with dutiful regularity, and that both women had developed standard responses to navigate. Debbie had her lines. Elizabeth had hers. The story had calcified into its received form. Elizabeth the villain, Debbie the victim, Eddie the man nobody quite remembered to blame. And then, in interviews conducted over the last decade of both women's lives, Debbie Reynolds began to say something different. Not dramatically different, not a full reversal, but different enough that people who had followed the story for 50 years sat up straighter when they heard it. She said that she had come to understand, with the distance of time, that the situation had been more complicated than she had seen it from the inside. She said that grief, real grief, the kind that Mike Todd's death had produced in Elizabeth, was not a simple thing, and that the vulnerability it created was not always within a person's control. She said that she did not think Elizabeth had set out to destroy her marriage, that intention and outcome are not always the same thing, and that she had perhaps, in the fury of her own pain, assigned a deliberateness to Elizabeth's actions that may not have been entirely accurate. She stopped well short of the word forgiveness. But she traveled a considerable distance from where she had started, and the journey cost her something, because there were people who had organized part of their own emotional lives around the narrative of Elizabeth Taylor as the woman who never said sorry, and Debbie's revised account complicated that narrative in ways that were not entirely comfortable. What had shifted? The most honest answer is probably time. The way that decades smooth the sharpest edges of old pain without erasing it. The way that living long enough introduces you to your own capacity for complicated behavior, which tends to produce a retrospective generosity toward other people's. Debbie had experienced her own losses, her own failures, her own moments of behaving in ways she would not have chosen in calmer circumstances. She had been married and divorced herself, multiple times, and she understood by then that human beings in the grip of strong feeling do not always navigate by the rules that seem obvious from the outside. The way that 1958 and 1959 treated Elizabeth Taylor, the specific quality of the fury directed at her, the way it landed almost entirely on her and largely passed over Eddie Fisher, reveals something about the era that has not entirely disappeared. In the moral economy of mid-century America, a woman who disrupted a marriage was a predator. A man who left his wife was exercising a regrettable but essentially human weakness. The asymmetry was so thoroughly built into the culture that almost no one paused to observe it explicitly, because asymmetries that are universal tend to be invisible to the people who live inside them. Elizabeth Taylor was held responsible for Eddie Fisher's choices in a way that Eddie Fisher was not, and the hatred directed at her was calibrated to a standard of female behavior that her male equivalent was never asked to meet. What Elizabeth understood, and what the decades since have increasingly confirmed, is that her refusal to apologize was not the absence of accountability but the assertion of something more fundamental. That she was not going to accept a framework in which her behavior was the problem and his was simply the weather. She had not gone to Eddie Fisher. He had come to her, in her grief, in the months when she was at her most depleted and least defended, and whatever had happened between them had happened in both directions. She was not prepared to perform a guilt she did not feel in the proportions the public demanded, and the public's anger at her refusal, the way it intensified when she declined to break, was itself evidence of what was actually being asked of her. She was being asked to confirm the narrative. She declined. By the time Debbie Reynolds offered her quietly devastating reassessment of what had happened between the three of them, Elizabeth Taylor had been dead for several years. She died in March of 2011, 53 years almost to the month after Mike Todd's plane went down over New Mexico, having never issued the apology that America had spent decades waiting for. What she left behind was a career of extraordinary range, a humanitarian legacy in AIDS activism that saved lives in numbers that dwarf any box office figure, and a story that keeps refusing to resolve itself into the simple shape that people keep trying to press it into. Debbie Reynolds's final word on Elizabeth Taylor was not forgiveness, exactly. It was something more honest, an acknowledgement that the story she had told herself for 50 years had been, in certain respects, incomplete. That Elizabeth had been a 26-year-old woman in devastating grief who had made choices she could not fully control and had then faced a level of public punishment wildly disproportionate to what the situation required. That the man who had actually made the vows to Debbie Reynolds had escaped the story relatively intact while the woman who had not made those vows bore the full weight of the culture's judgment. The house where Eddie Fisher first came to offer his condolences no longer stands. The magazines that printed Elizabeth Taylor's face with headlines about betrayal are mostly gone. But the question the story raises, about who gets blamed when a marriage ends, and why, and whether 50 years of additional information changes the accounting, is not historical at all. It is happening right now, in different names and different circumstances, and it will happen again. The only thing that changes, if we are paying attention, is our willingness to look at it clearly. Debbie Reynolds, in the end, was willing. That matters. And so, in her own way, was Elizabeth.